Evolution is used by atheists to explain where all the complex biodiversity came from. And so in Conquering Mount Evolution, we already proved why we know evolution is wrong and the Bible's creation account is true. And so if that's the case, if the Bible's creation account is true, then where did all the species come from? And where did all the races come from? So before we get into this, we need to define our terms just so we know exactly what we're talking about here. When we say evolution, evolution is a belief that all living things descend from one common ancestor, and that common ancestor was a single-celled organism that itself just coalesced from a chemical soup, and the chemical soup did not have any genetic information, but somehow from nowhere that genetic information just coalesced to form a cell, and that cell somehow made itself more complex and became all the life we see today. So evolution is basically a belief that a simple organism can make itself more complex over time until its descendants are as complex as we humans are. It believes in upward change, if you will. Now there's some other terms that people like to use interchangeably with evolution that really don't prove evolution, so let's be careful about that. One of those terms is natural selection. Natural selection is not synonymous with evolution. Natural selection is just when environmental changes weed out organisms that have detrimental traits, while at the same time allowing organisms with beneficial traits to be preserved. Here's a simple example of what natural selection is. Let's say in one region you had dogs of two different fur lengths. Let's say you had a long-furred dog and a short-furred dog. If that environment suddenly became cold and the climate became more icy, then the short-haired dogs would likely all freeze to death, leaving behind the long-haired dogs, because the dog's long hair would be considered a beneficial trait, whereas the other dog's short hair would be considered a detrimental trait. And so the dog with the detrimental trait would die out, leaving the long-haired dog to become the dominant species in that area. Likewise, if instead of the climate becoming cold, let's say the climate became infested with fleas or ticks, if the flea or the tick that was infesting the land preferred to live in the fur of long-coated dogs, in that situation, the long hair would be a detriment and the short hair would be a benefit. And so the dog that had the long fur would die out, leaving behind nothing but short-furred dogs, and they would then become the dominant species or the dominant breed in that area. So that's all natural selection really is. Natural selection is when a detrimental trait is weeded out and a beneficial trait is increased. But is this the same thing as evolution? No, it is not. Why? Because in natural selection, pre-existent genetic information is weeded out. This does not create genetic information from nothing, which is what evolution basically requires. And so, in a sense, natural selection is actually the opposite of evolution, because it's removal of genetic information, not adding it. And so natural selection does not prove evolution. Survival of the fittest does happen in nature, but just because an unfit animal dies, that doesn't prove that we all evolved out of a chemical soup. Now, the next term that is used interchangeably with evolution is mutation. Now, let's be very careful with what mutation is. Mutation is when pre-existent genetic information is scrambled or lost. And we see this happening all the time. This is why disease happens. This is why there's diversity of phenotypes, because it's a scrambling of the genetic information. Sometimes that genetic information gets scrambled so badly, it might lead to something like Down syndrome. Other times, it might get lost altogether. Here's an example of that. You have a particular type of cat in parts of Europe that does not grow a tail, because the genetic information to make that tail, the cat's called the Manx cat, by the way, the genetic information to make that tail has been scrambled and lost. And so you're going from a cat with a tail to a cat without a tail. And so that is one example of genetic information being lost. This is a mutation. But does this prove evolution? No, because for evolution to work, genetic material has to basically be able to just come from nowhere. You have to be able to go from a soup of chemicals that have no genes in and of themselves to complex genetic machinery that forms the cell. And this is not proved by mutation. Mutation only changes what is there. It does not create something that does not exist. And so that is why mutation does not prove evolution, because the type of change that takes you from a cat that has a tail to a cat without a tail is not the same thing as going from a chemical to a cell, or going from a cell to a worm, or a worm to a fish. So mutation only changes the organism based on its pre-existent genetic material. It does not add new genetic material from nowhere. So mutation does not prove evolution. Another favorite of evolutionists that they try to run to is speciation. Speciation is when mutation and natural selection, which we already discussed, cause some animals of a particular kind to lose the ability to interbreed. The most common example of this being the seagulls that are around the Arctic Circle. But basically, here's what speciation is. So you have three types of seagulls here. For instance, we're going to just name these seagull groups A, B, and C. If the seagulls in group A can mate with the seagulls in group B, and the seagulls in group B can mate with the seagulls in group C, you would think that A and C can mate as well, but it's not the case. You actually have some seagulls that have lost the ability to interbreed, despite the fact that several generations ago they descended from seagulls that could interbreed. And so an atheist would point at this and say, see, this is an example. The seagulls are diverging. They're evolving into different types of animals. They're just evolving away from each other. But that is not what's happening here. What's happening here is that each of these animals has lost chromosomes or has lost genetic information. And so you can't prove that you gain genetic information from nothing by giving me an example where animals are losing genetic information. That is the opposite effect. And so what you basically have here is one seagull has a certain kind of defect in its gene code, and another seagull has a different defect in its gene code, and those difference in those defects prevents them from being able to mate with one another. So showing me examples of defective seagulls does not prove that we all evolved out of a puddle of chemicals, because at the end of the day, they're still seagulls. Seagulls A, B, and C, though they can't all interbreed, are still seagulls. They're not on their way to becoming a pterodactyl or a lizard or something. So just because there is a change within the kinds does not prove that there can be a change between the kinds. So in a nutshell, speciation does not prove evolution, because loss of the ability to interbreed does not mean that the seagulls are increasing in complexity and evolving into something else. It's not a new kind of animal. It may be a different species of seagull, but ultimately it's still a seagull. It's not on its way to becoming anything else like evolution would predict. And then finally, the last term that people like to use that interchangeably with evolution to try to prove it is something I will call cultural preference. Now, in your textbooks, you might read of this labeled as sexual selection, but I call it cultural preference because it applies to humans as well. People in one culture or another might prefer one particular physical trait as being more attractive than another, and in that case, the traits that are deemed as unattractive are isolated or weeded out, because those people will have less opportunities to mate, and the people with the seemingly attractive trait might become the dominant group of people in that land. Say, for example, you have a region where you have blondes and brunettes. If the culture in that land dictated that blonde was more attractive than brunette, then you might see that more blonde women would have an easier time finding mates, and the brunette women would have a harder time, and they would become weeded out, leading to the blonde phenotype becoming the dominant physical trait in that land. But again, that's not evolution either, because that's just certain traits getting weeded out. That's not showing organisms becoming more complex over time. Showing that people prefer one phenotype over another depending on your culture does not get you from a bacteria to a fish to a lizard to a monkey to a man. So it's just not the same. And so to explain all the biodiversity or all the differences in phenotype that you see in appearance in all of the organisms you see today, natural selection, mutation, speciation, and cultural preference can explain it all without the need to evoke evolution. Evolution is not necessary whatsoever. So now that we've defined our terms, let's get back to the question at hand. Where did all the different species come from, and where did all the races come from if they didn't evolve? So let's talk about the first question. Where did all the different species come from? We know from the book of Genesis 8:19 that all of the land animals we see today descend from different pairs of animals that Noah brought on the ark. The Bible says every beast and every creeping thing and every fowl whatsoever creepeth upon the earth after their kinds went forth out of the ark. So the fact that it says every creeping thing lets us know that all land animals descend from different pairs that were brought on the ark by Noah. But that's going to lead to an obvious question. How could all of those animals possibly fit on the ark? And so a lot of people think of Noah's Ark as your ordinary cruise ship or as a yacht or something like that. We're underestimating truly how massive Noah's Ark was. The Bible says that the ark was 300 cubits long and 50 cubits wide and 30 cubits high. Now, a cubit is roughly 20 inches. Now, based on that information, we can get an idea of how large the ark was if a cubit is 20 inches. So that means the length of the ark was 167 yards. The width of the ark was 28 yards, and the height of the ark was 16 yards. Now again, these are rough estimates, but they get you in the ballpark. So the total amount of cubic yards that the ark could accommodate is 75,000. That is absolutely massive. But to make this make sense in the common vernacular, the ark was as long as 1.5 football fields. Think about that. That's a pretty huge ship. And so we know that the ark was plenty spacious, but what about all the different types of animals Noah would have needed to bring on the ark to produce all of the biodiversity that we see today? A lot of people have this false idea that in order for Noah to get all of the different species we see today, Noah needed to bring 2 of each species and 2 of each breed of the species. But that's not true at all. A lot of people, for example, think that to get all the dogs that we see today, Noah would have had to bring 2 Rottweilers, 2 Chihuahuas, 2 Great Danes, 2 German Shepherds, 2 of every dog you can think of on the ark. Is that the case? Did Noah need to bring 2 of all 336 breeds of dog? Did Noah need nearly 700 dogs just to account for the dog kind? No, not at all. How do we know this? Well, if you look at the book of Genesis chapter 6 verse 19, when it talks about what Noah brought on the ark, it does not talk about bringing each species or subspecies. If you look at what Genesis 6:19 says, it says, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring on the ark. And then in verse 20 it says, of fowls of the air after their kind, of cattle after their kind. And so you see that here the Bible is using the words kind and sort interchangeably. And then it gives you 2 examples of what a kind or a sort is. It talks about fowls and cattle. Now if you notice, fowl and cattle are not names of subspecies. These are just generic terms for that type of animal. And so, for example, to bring 2 of the cattle kind, Noah did not need to bring 2 cows of the domestic sort, 2 water buffalo, 2 Cape buffalo, 2 yaks. Noah just needed to bring 2 of the cattle kind, and whatever the 2 cattle he brought, they possessed with them enough genetic information to make all of the different types of cows that we see today. And so the phrase sort and kind do not mean species or subspecies like we think of it today. The terms sort and kind were more broad, more generic. Noah didn't need 2 of each individual species. He just needed 2 of the family or of the genus, as we call it today. So let me give you a practical example of this. We know now that all modern dogs are descended from the wolf, or they're all related to the wolf, Or to put this in simple terms, all dogs today are mutated versions of the wolf. And so to account for all of the dogs that we see today, Noah didn't need to bring 2 of each breed of dog. If Noah, for example, had just brought 2 wolves with him, then later on, the wolves would have had puppies, and they would have had puppies, and so on and so forth, and those puppies would have been naturally selected in different regions, or would have speciated in different regions to create all the varieties of dog we see today. But be very careful. This is not evolution. This is actually a loss of genetic information. And so your domestic dog that you have in your house right now is actually a degenerate form of the wolf. It's not evolving, it's actually going quite in the opposite direction. There's less genetic information there. And to give another practical example of this, let's consider big cats. Lions have golden brown fur, which allows them to blend in with the vegetation in the plains of Africa, giving them an advantage while they hunt. Meanwhile, tigers have stripes to camouflage them while hunting in the jungles of Asia. Despite their differences in physical appearance, lions and tigers can interbreed and create ligers. And the ligers have golden brown fur and stripes. And so the fact that the lion and the tiger can interbreed means that in essence, the lion and the tiger are the same animal, just in 2 different colorings. And this means that to get lions and tigers, Noah did not need to bring 2 lions on the ark and 2 tigers on the ark. If Noah just brought 2 liger-type animals on the ark, then those ligers would have later had descendants, and some of the descendants of the liger just inherited the stripes and went on to become tigers, and other descendants of the liger would have just inherited the golden brown fur and would have gone on to become lions. And each of those animals would have survived better in a region where the environment was more favorable to them, leading them to become the dominant predator in that region. So that's just simple inheritance and natural selection. That's got absolutely nothing to do with evolution, because at the end of the day, they're still big cats. And so I say all this to show that Noah did not need to bring 2 of each subcategory that we think of today. If Noah just brought 2 of the family or of the genus, those animals would have possessed the genetic information to give us all of the varieties that we see today, just through natural selection and mutation and speciation, without the need to evoke evolution. And so whenever someone asks you, how could all of the animals possibly have fit on the ark? Your response is very straightforward. The ark had enough room. Noah didn't need 2 of each subspecies, so that cuts down on the number of animals Noah actually needed to bring. The animals Noah brought possessed within them enough of a genetic variety to make all the animals we see today, and that different animals went on to thrive better in different regions, which is why you have different predators or different animals in different regions. So it's pretty straightforward. Simple inheritance and natural selection, no need to evoke evolution whatsoever. Now let's talk about something a little more tricky. Where did all the races come from? Why do you have different ethnicities and different skin colors and different hair textures and such? So evolutionists basically believe this is the history of humankind. They believe that we all descended from an ape-like creature somewhere in the middle of Africa, such as the Australopithecus africanus, and that this creature eventually evolved into humans, and that all these humans migrated from Africa to go live in different regions throughout the world. And when they got to those different regions, that they evolved a different skin color or whatever based on their environment. This is how they explain why you have dark-skinned people in more hot and sunny regions and whiter-skinned people in more northern European regions. This is all known as the out of Africa theory. Now, we've already disproved the Australopithecus in Conquering Mount Evolution. So we already know that this version of human history is false. So if the Bible's version of human history is true, that we all came from Adam and Eve, as Genesis 3:20 says, and that we are all of one blood, as Acts chapter 17 says, then why is there so much variation in human appearance? Because if you look at Acts 17:26, it says, we are of one blood, because it says God made all nations of one blood. So this shows that there's only one race, the human race. So then why is there so much variation among humans? By the way, the genetic difference that exists between a white and a black person is the same difference that would exist between any two given white people. So even science backs up what the Bible says, that there is only one race, the human race. So if there's only one race, the human race, and if we all came from Adam and Eve, then why do you have so many different physical appearances? Where did that all come from? Well, there are two possible ways to answer this question, and the truth is one of these two. Either Adam and Eve were what you would call an interracial couple, or Adam and Eve were both brown-skinned. And we're going to explore what both possibilities would mean. So, if Adam and Eve were a quote-unquote interracial couple, where one was extremely dark and the other one was extremely light, then it's a simple done deal. One of them already possessed the genetic information to make the darkest people that we see on the planet, and the other already possessed the genetic information to make the lighter people we see on the planet, and all of the shades in between would have been covered by their children. And so, in the next generation, Adam and Eve's children, when they went on to have children, would have been multiple, multicolored people producing even more variation. For example, this is a famous case of a couple. Both members of this couple here, the husband and the wife, are both mixed race. They're both mixed with white and black, basically. And if you look at their children, one of the children came out completely white, whereas the other one came out on the brown side. And so this shows that if you were to take two multiracial people and they have kids, you could get enormous variety in physical appearance just within a couple of generations. And so you don't need the millions of years of evolution that the atheists will try to tell you. Variation can happen very quickly within just one generation. Because if you notice, the daughter on the right looks significantly more like a Caucasian than either of her parents do, and she's just one generation removed from them. So that's the first possibility, that Adam and Eve were an interracial couple, and between them you get all the variety you see today. Now, there's another possibility that both Adam and Eve were brown, were middle complexioned. And I actually think that this is the most likely explanation. Why? Because in Genesis chapter 2, verse 22, the Bible says that God made Eve from the rib of Adam. So that likely means that they both had the same DNA if one was literally made from the physical substance of the other. And so if that is the case, then we're likely not dealing with an interracial couple. We are dealing with two people of the same skin tone, just like these two mixed race, this husband and wife are the same skin tone, but even they were able to produce variety within one generation. If you remember your Punnett square from 10th grade biology class, let's give an example with alleles here. Let's say that there's an allele for dark skin, and if you get two of them, the dominant allele, that you get dark skin. Let's let the two recessive alleles make a person light skinned or white skinned, and if you have one dominant allele and one recessive allele, you're somewhere in the middle. You're brown skinned. If Adam and Eve were both heterozygous, in that they had one dominant allele and one recessive, and they were both medium-skinned, then when they had children, their children would have been all colors of the spectrum, as you see with this Punnett square here. And so the two dominant alleles with the big A would be the darker-skinned children, and the two recessive alleles with the little a would have been the lighter-skinned children, or what you know as white people today. And then you had all the colors in between, with the heterozygous children who had one dominant allele and one recessive allele. So literally, within a few generations, you can get all the skin colors in the spectrum if you start with two parents who are medium brown. And that's what I think most likely happened with Adam and Eve and their generations. And so Adam and Eve's descendants would have had a diversity of genetic information, a diversity of phenotype, and a diversity of skin color. So when Noah's family got on the ark, there would have been enough diversity in that family already coming from Adam and Eve, their ancestors, to give us all the diversity we see today with no issue. Now, that leads us to the question, if it's the case that all the diversity came from Adam and Eve and from Noah's family, why is it that you tend to see darker skinned people as the dominant physical appearance in hotter, sunnier regions, like in India with the Tamil people, or in Africa with the sub-Saharans, or even the Aboriginals, and in more northern European climates where there's less sun and it's colder, you tend to see more pale skin, like with Europeans. But in the tropical or the moderate climates, you tend to see brown-skinned people. Is that evolution? Does that mean that people just evolved in response to the environment? No, it does not. Here is why. If you remember in the biblical account, the Bible said that Noah's descendants were all in one place and all had one language. And this was right before the Tower of Babel. So all of the people of the earth had one language and were in one region. God later dispersed them and so sent them all to all the different parts of the earth in Genesis chapter 11. And so God dispersed all of the people from Babel, from the Tower of Babel, and caused them to be scattered all about the earth. And so, by the way, the idea of a mass migration of all of humankind from one region spreading across the earth, that originates with the Bible. Okay, and so the out of Africa theory is basically a ripoff of the Tower of Babel account, only it's a worse version because it's not even true. But that's beside the point. So after God dispersed all of the people all over the earth, we basically get a similar situation with, I gave you the example of the lion and the tiger and how each one's skin color or camouflage gave it an advantage in a different environment where it became dominant. And so you get a similar situation that would have happened to all the humans. So if everyone of all the different shades were scattered abroad, naturally speaking, people with different phenotypes would survive better in different regions. Say, for example, the group of people that scattered and went into the harsh desert-like environments of Africa or maybe parts of the Middle East, that harsh sun would have given skin cancer to people whose skin was too light, and they would not have survived as well. But the darker-skinned person who has superior melanin supply would have been able to survive and become the dominant phenotype in those harsh, sunnier regions. But then, when certain groups of people migrated to the more northern, colder climates, now the people with darker skin, their melanin works against them because they're not able to absorb enough of the sunlight to strengthen their bones and get vitamin D, and so they would die from all sorts of bone-related diseases, whereas the white person whose skin is thin enough to soak up sun from a minimally sunny environment would have done better in that environment, and he would have become the dominant phenotype in the more northern European type climates. And then in a more moderate climate where there's too much sun for the white person to properly survive, but not enough sun for the black person or the person with darker skin to get what they need, then the middle complexion person would have shown through in that environment, would have survived and become the dominant phenotype in that environment. But as you can see, that is just people migrating to different regions. And the Bible teaches this. And that is just natural selection causing one group of people to survive better than others. But this is not evolution. There's no new genetic material being added in this situation. It is just people surviving better in a region that is more suitable to their phenotype. But that has nothing to do with trying to prove that we came from a chemical soup that somehow coalesced into a single cell. So as you can see, natural selection and migration are the reason why we have people with different phenotypes. Not to mention cultural preference. There's certain groups of Europeans that have one hair color or another, and these could all be the result of cultural preference. And cultural preference can produce great variety. For example, if in one region they prefer short people, so short people get to pass on their genes more often, or if in another culture they prefer taller people, so taller people got to pass on the genetic information more often. But all of this is genetic information being weeded out, not added or created out of nowhere, as evolution predicts. So in summation, the answer to the question where all the races came from is simple. There is only one race, that is the human race. That Adam and Eve had enough genetic information between the two of them to get all the colors we see today, and this is why Noah likely had a diverse family when he went on board the ark. And when they all got off of the ark, and then after the Tower of Babel and they dispersed, different phenotypes survived better in different environments. The environment didn't change their phenotype. The environment just determined which phenotype would survive in that region, and that all the other differences can just be relegated to culture. So let's recap all of this. When answering the question, where did the different species come from, and where did the races come from, you can confidently answer like this. Natural selection is responsible for the variety we see today, but that's not evolution. It's a weeding out, not an adding of genetic information. Noah's Ark certainly was big enough. We already covered how it had enough room. Noah didn't need 2 of each subspecies, just 2 of the genus or the family, and they could have given us all the variety we see today. There was only one race, the human race, and Noah's family had enough genetic diversity to make all races of people, and that different phenotypes of both humans and animals survive better in different environments. And that is why we have so much of the diversity we see today. God bless.